I am now pleased to introduce to you our trainer today. Donna Fettis is a gerontologist and founder of Borrow My Glasses, LLC, an education firm co-founded and produced with producer Lauren Lewis to bring new perspectives to aging and caregiving through customized workshops, programs, videos, and events. As a gerontologist educator for nearly 30 years, Donna brings her passion for dementia and caregiving issues, curriculum design and teaching, coalition building, and new program strategy. She is an adjunct professor at two Connecticut colleges, offers a wide array of continuing education workshops, and is a frequent presenter at local, state, and national conferences. So we welcome Donna this morning. Good morning, Donna.
Hello, Amy. Thank you so much for organizing today, facilitating, and also for that introduction. And good morning to everyone joining us. Really happy to be with you this morning. And I appreciate with all of the things that all of us have to do every day that you've taken some time out to learn a little bit more about recognizing and responding to the needs of older adults. And one of the best things or most interesting things about working in the field of aging is that I know that you're all showing up today as a professional, right? And that what you learn will absolutely help you with the older adults that you come in contact with through your work. But also, gerontology is your life. Aging is your future, literally. And so what you learn today will also help you with your own life, your own aging, your own family, your own neighbors, your own communities that you're a part of as well. So very, very pleased that you've taken time out to be here today. So here's our topic for today, recognizing and responding to the needs of older adults. And we're going to jump right into our learning objectives so you have a sense of what we'll be covering in the next hour and a half. We will discuss ways to improve communication with older adults, recognize and respond to older adults with vision and hearing impairments, describe how COVID is impacting older adults specifically, and identify selected resources for older adults. And our topic is generally broad today. And so when I was designing the workshop, I wanted to make sure we spent quite a bit of time on communication, because that's something that you're going to do absolutely with every older person that you're in contact with for work and also outside of work in your own personal life. However, there's all kinds of specifics that we can go into, and how COVID is impacting older adults, some special populations and special considerations. We'll get into that to some degree, and I'll be pointing you to resources that you can follow up in greater detail about any of these issues toward the end. As far as questions go, you can always put questions in the chat. I can see that. Let me make sure I can see that. I can sort of see that depending on what else is on the screen for me. So feel free to put your questions into chat. And Amy, if you can just help out, if there's any burning question, you can interrupt me and ask, or we'll have questions at the end for time at the end for questions as well. All right, and here we go. To set the context for this morning's workshop, I really want to show you this. This is the shape of happiness curve. And it's a really interesting slide that puts together findings from 7 massive surveys. So the results that you see, each line represents a different survey. This covers worldwide audiences. It's all over the world, and about 1.3 million people were randomly sampled from 51 countries as part of these studies cumulatively. And they're basically asking people about happiness and how happy they are, and they're self-reporting. So you can see on the left, it's their happiness score, and on the bottom is their age. And if you find your age on the bottom, see if that maps on for you. What we generally see, though, when asking more than 1 million people the world over, is sort of incredible that we have the same patterns. So younger people in our society tend to rate themselves as pretty happy. And look who else rates themselves as pretty happy? Older people, right? So in the middle, where I'm guessing most of us are on this call, are the least happy people typically. And I think when people were thinking of their happiness, they were probably thinking of their stresses, all the things that they're juggling things that are going on in their life, their family, their work, and so on. That probably accounts for a lot of that. But this might run counter to what you would expect. I think a lot of times we have a little bit of an ageist bias in terms of thinking older adults, oh my God, they're desperate, they're dismal, they're depressed, it's horrible. And it's not true, actually. So we want to just state that, even though today we will certainly be talking about some of the more challenging issues that come with aging for people, overall, that's not the whole picture, and it's a much more nuanced situation. So let's get into some communication tips. You obviously communicate with people all the time. Also, communication is one of those areas that all of us can stand to improve on and just think a little bit more closely about. So we'll be thinking about how to communicate with older adults today. It is true that as we age, part of normal aging is sensory decline in all of our senses. So it gets a little harder to see, to hear. Our sense of taste and smell is a bit diminished. Our tactile sensitivity, how sensitive our touch is also diminished to some degree with normal aging. When it comes to communication, basically hearing and vision become primary. And so we'll be focusing mostly on those today, starting with vision. So I would invite you to put some ideas into the chat. I don't think you want to assume that all older people have severe vision impairment, but some absolutely do. So as you think now about when you interact with people, how do you know if someone has a vision impairment? You can pop things right into the chat as they come to you. What would be a sign that someone you're talking with, communicating with, has a vision impairment? Squinting, absolutely. Yep, that's a good signal. They're wearing glasses. That's a great signal. That's telling you a lot. A prosthetic device, right? What else? You're communicating with someone if they're rubbing their eyes, if they're blinking, right? If they're indicating some distress. Moving closer to what they're looking at. Very interesting one, hearing aids, because it might indicate they have a hearing issue, which might indicate vision. They might be over relying on vision if they can't hear. Absolutely interesting. Tearing eyes. Based on how they're using their eye contact, they could be trying to communicate to you that they just don't understand. Looking at you funny. Exactly. These are great. Also, just telling you they can't see something, right? If they're doing what we sometimes say, the trombone arm, right? Which I do all the time now in my middle years, trying to get the object into a visual, a spot in their visual field where they can actually see it. Those are great. So now let's say you're communicating with someone and you picked up the fact that they do have some trouble seeing. What would you do about that? How would you respond to someone if you thought they had a vision impairment? Mm-hmm. You could ask if they've seen a doctor and sort of when's their next eye doctor appointment. Put yourself in that moment. You've now noticed someone might have a vision problem. What else do you think you could do? Move closer to them. Mm-hmm. Ask if they need your assistance. Read it to them. Excellent. So if they're having trouble with one sense, their vision, maybe you can tap into another sense, their hearing. Just check in with them. Are you having trouble reading this? How can I help you? Great. So these are a couple of really, really good suggestions. And I want to encourage this process of when you're communicating with someone, tuning into them. I think it can be an issue sometimes when, more so in the doctor's office or somewhere where there's a lot of multitasking going on and a person's asking a question, but not really paying attention and looking at the person that they're trying to communicate with. And that in itself can cause problems. We'll talk more about that when we get to hearing in a minute. You had some good strategies. I want to add to your list and give you more tools for your toolbox in terms of how to respond if you thought someone had vision impairment. You could actually increase the light, right? You could turn up the light if that's possible. You can physically bring them and the item over to a source of light, like a window. You can actually try for spotlighting, right? So if there's a light to turn on in the place where they are, or even you can use your phone flashlight if that's appropriate where you are. If possible, you can get them a larger print version. So do you have a copy of that handout in larger print font, or can you get that to them afterward and make it available to them? Reading it aloud, someone mentioned in the chat, which is great. Another thing that you can do is use a cue. And so I used to work at a hospital a long time ago in Philadelphia, and we offered free parking to members of our program when they came to visit their person at the hospital, and they had to sign for those parking tickets. And you could just tell when a person was looking at the thing that we needed them to sign, some of them couldn't see it. They were sort of scanning, they were looking, they weren't like going to do the action that we had said, sign your name. And so what we often did was we put a big X in the spot where they needed to sign, or we would physically put our finger on the beginning of the line because they couldn't decipher the line for their signature, but they could sure see the arm and the finger pointing at the place that they needed to sign. And it was a very subtle cue to say, oh, I see that this person is having trouble seeing. How can I help them? And so using some other cue like that is actually really helpful. Using emotion, come with me, the universal gestures and hand signs that we can use, those can really, really help communication. There's also things that you can do to increase the contrast, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So just a couple of points to share. Older eyes absolutely need more light than people in their 20s to see as clearly. And it's quite a bit of light, 3 to 4 times the amount of light. So that's pretty significant. I'm sure some of you have had the experience. Remember eating in a restaurant? If you've had that experience, it feels like a long time ago. But you bring your phone and you turn your phone flashlight on, right? Because you can't read the menu because it's so dark in terms of the mood lighting. So increasing the light is absolutely something that you can do when you're communicating with older adults. Older eyes become more sensitive to glare. We'll talk about how to handle that in a minute. Older eyes can have trouble refocusing quickly from light to dark and from near to far. So you may have had this kind of experience. Say you went to a movie. Remember going to movies? You went to a movie in the middle of the day and you come out of the dark movie theater where you've been for a while and it's a really bright sunny day. And it sort of takes a minute for your eyes to refocus, right? Or you're outside on a nice sunny day and you're coming into the house where it is darker and you're sort of blinded for a minute, right? That's what's going on is your eyes are adjusting to the new level of light. And you probably realize it's kind of unsafe. If there are stairs there, you're going to be more likely to stumble a little bit. It can have safety ramifications. This is something normal for older adults. And also, people as they age can't as easily discriminate colors and contrast. And we're going to talk about how you can incorporate that into your communicating to do a better job. So as we put some principles into practice, look at this picture. And if you were trying to communicate with an older adult in a setting like this, what would you do to help the older person see better? Where would you kind of encourage them to sit? And I would say you can take yourself off mute if you want to respond to that or put something in the chat, whichever you prefer. Where would you have the older person sit to reduce the glare experience for them? Away from them, away from the sun. Somewhere in the middle. Interesting. The window. Yay. Okay. The window. So if you sit the person in front of the window with their back to the window, that's going to be the best thing. You can see where we're seated, and I'm saying seated, our perspective is looking out the window. And you can see how much glare we're experiencing sitting kind of where we're sitting in the picture. But if it was flipped around and the older person, or we, to be honest, any of us, were sitting near the window with our back to the window, it's going to be the opposite effect. The light coming through the window is actually going to light up their subject, and it's going to reduce that glare coming into their eyes, right? So another principle to practice kind of thing, you can see why it becomes so hard to drive at night for a lot of older adults, right? Because normal aging, they're going to be more sensitive to glare. Headlights coming at you when you're driving at night can cause glare. It can be temporarily blinding, super disorienting. So if you have the choice, and this can be even visiting your grandma, or your whoever older person, um, put them, and you can do it without saying anything, without calling it out kind of, and maybe embarrassing them, but you can just seat them, organize it so that they're sitting with their back to the source of light, and it's going to be a lot easier for them to see, to communicate with you. Here's another tip and another way to put some of these principles into practice. This concept of high contrast is a really, really important one, and it runs throughout so many different areas. So if I show you this and you think about your printed materials, low contrast, medium contrast, high contrast. I'm not going to force you to say, but the high contrast is obviously easier for people to see. I'm assuming, I think it would be. So you want to really think about that in your printed materials. It's very important for older adults to be able to read what you're sharing with them, but it really helps everybody to see better. So high contrast is a good thing. Interestingly, this is a blue background here. If you have a choice, don't use blue paper. If you have colored paper choices, don't use blue and green, because often your print is going to be black coming off the copier, right? And so that's not high contrast. It's much easier for older adults to see, differentiate colors and see clearly when you're on the yellow end, the orange end, even the red end to some degree of the color spectrum. Much harder for them to distinguish blues, greens, purples, blacks. That doesn't show up as well. So thinking about high contrast, that's actually important. Also, you never want to use text over pictures, right? That should be separate. If you're having text on a handout, it should have a clear field behind it, not over a picture, anything like that. No watermarks, so that kind of print, you can go behind the print that you really want them to see, nothing like that. That's really, really hard for older adults to see. Here's another example where high contrast can make things easier for someone to see. And this is a real example. I'm not sure you're using any of these strategies as far as nutrition and eating with people you're working with, but for sure this will come in for people in your life. So the food on the blue plate is so much easier to see because there's high contrast. When you have food that's kind of the same color as the plate it's on, or when your plate is sort of the same color as the placemat or the table, or the silverware is white plastic on a white plastic tablecloth at an event, or a clear plastic cup on a white plastic tablecloth. Very, very hard for older adults to see that and then to negotiate the space. And you think about the ramifications of that. That can be huge, actually. One of my colleagues was talking to a college class that I teach at Quinnipiac University about her dad. And unfortunately, he has really low vision. He has macular degeneration and glaucoma. And he was eating out, and she said it was hard to watch him kind of stabbing around with his fork to hope to hit some food on his plate because he actually couldn't see what he was doing because of the contrast. And he was embarrassed and he didn't want to call that out. He didn't want to ask for help. And so he would often just say no, to eating with people because it was really, really challenging for him just to see. Now, in his case, that was not part of normal aging. He had eye diseases, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But in general, high contrast is better. So this is something that you can use this principle and run so many scenarios through it as you work with older adults. So you're sort of scanning their environment if you're working with them in person or even on Zoom, and trying to up the contrast any way that you can. Also, in terms of the environment and printed materials and signage, matte, so that, kind of flat finish is going to be preferred over glossy or high shine finish for older adults. And you can see why in the picture, right? The picture with the caution sign, I actually took that myself, where I teach at Quinnipiac University, and I love Quinnipiac. They do a lot of wonderful things. But this is not one of them. Whoever chose this flooring, and certainly they might not be designing for older adults, although it tends to be universal design actually. But we happened to be walking by there, and the custodian was nearby and was just about to remove that sign. And I said, "Is that floor still wet?" And the person said, "No, it's dry. I'm going to take that sign down." I'm like, "Really?" So if you were walking down that corridor and you were a person who has compromised vision, or any older adult who's going to be sensitive to glare, how could that affect how you walk down that hallway? If you change how you walk down that hallway, are you more likely to fall? Yes, you are more likely to fall. Zigzag to try to avoid the water, right? And it would be even more pronounced if you had dementia. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But this kind of a setup would be really hard for people with dementia. Um, you can see how it looks like water, right? I can tell you that people with dementia, not everyone, but people who have this particular visual disturbance, if they have dementia, will experience dark spots as a whole. And so you can see, you can think of those white and black floors, the different color tiles, and people will try to maneuver around to stay on the white squares because they're experiencing the black squares as a whole if they have dementia. In this case, it would just look like, how do I avoid the water, right? In the person's kitchen and that lower corner, you can see how hard it would be to negotiate that space. As beautiful as it is, at the first glance. The flooring up at the top with the matte finish, a lot easier for people to negotiate. And what this floor actually also has, if you can see it, it kind of runs under the garbage can on the radiator, but there's a border around there, right? That's really great for older eyes. Some of those wayfinding paths, we sometimes call that. If you have drop-down ceilings, that can sort of function in the same way sometimes, where they're creating a wayfinding path for a person. Placement of furniture is actually another way that you could really help older adults to navigate space. So this is veering a little bit beyond communication, but you can see how setting up space for older eyes is actually really, really important. So I want to talk for just a second about some things that are not part of normal aging, but these are common visual issues that older adults have, part of disease processes, right? Cataracts, diabetic retinopathy, glaucoma, and macular degeneration. And in the next couple of slides, I want people to, what I say, borrow their glasses, borrow the glasses of people having these experiences, meaning understanding it from their point of view. So if you have cataracts, and you look at this picture, you can see what that looks like. It's a little bit hazy. It's a little bit blurry. If you have glaucoma, this might be what you see. If someone has macular degeneration, that's what they're going to see. Now, the professor who I had come speak to my students, her father, he had both glaucoma and macular degeneration, right? So you can start to see how hard it was for him to get a lot of information from his visual surroundings. And when you can't see, we're not going to belabor the point. I'm hoping that you're already having some empathy for people who have these issues that go beyond normal aging, but they're common, and say, wow, this could make it really hard. No wonder they're talking slower. No wonder they're not responding appropriately, and so on. So it can be very, very challenging. People who have diabetic retinopathy might see this, where it looks like spots or smudges are all over things that they're trying to see. So hopefully seeing these images is going a distance to upping your understanding and borrowing someone's glasses. What could they be experiencing? And you now have a bunch of strategies that are going to help. Any thoughts or questions about that, about vision, before we move on to hearing? If you think of any, pop them into the chat. Thank you. Good information. So pop that into the chat, and we can come back to it if you want to. Let's move on to hearing for the moment. So again, how would you know if someone has a hearing impairment? Take yourself back to conversations you've had, maybe with your family, your clients. How do you know someone can't hear you? You can pop those right into the chat. Leaning in. Asked to repeat. They say, what? Can you repeat that? Excuse me? Yep, that's very common. Yes. Turn the volume up. Oh, the volume was at 98. Wow. They don't respond when you speak to them or ask a question. Right, that would indicate a hearing problem. Always asking, what? Yeah, for sure. Great. So you're onto it. These are some good ways that you would know. Again, not every older person has hearing impairment, but many do. I will tell you, it's not only about age. I have hearing impairment. Yeah, turning their head. I wear 2 hearing aids. I have my headphones in right now to connect me to my computer, but usually I wear 2 hearing aids, and I've gone through all of this stuff that you guys indicate. They stare especially at the mouth and lips. I do that all the time because you're kind of reading lips. That's a good one. Yeah, speak too loud. My kids are constantly like, Mom, shh. I cut my ear. Can picture me trying to get the big horn kind of thing attached to my ear to trap that sound to go in there. I turn my head. This is my better side. All of that you have said absolutely happens. You've gotten a lot of them. Oh, when they have the TV up loud and talking on the phone, trying to hear both communications. All right, Lori, good one. We're going to come back to that when we think of strategies. Let's move to that now. What would you do if you thought someone had a hearing impairment? You were communicating with someone, they have a hearing impairment, you picked that up, you've been a detective. What are you going to do about it? What would you do, Lori, in that situation? They have 2 things really loud going on. Get closer and speak slower. Excellent, Brenda. Sounds like you know people that have hearing impairments in your world. What do you do with them? Ask, can you hear me? And be respectful about that. I love, Sylvia, a couple of your comments have really had a nice way of bringing respect into the conversation. Yes, take out distractions. So if you have 2 things that are super loud and you know the person has a hearing impairment or they're not responding properly, they're not able to engage in that communication, turn both of those things off, preferably. Check in with them. Can you hear me? Have patience. Absolutely. Good. Any others? These are great. So you're onto it. I'm going to add to your toolbox a little bit and give you some other ways. Sit on the side you can hear. Absolutely. I'm forever, when I walk with my friends, I'm like, whoop, like I scoot around so that my good ear is the side that they're on. Absolutely. And if you're working with an older person that's sitting or not moving, you can move to the other side. Is this your good ear? Can you hear me okay? What you also can do is when you're moving yourself around, try to get in front of them so that they can absolutely see you. So one thing that happens with normal aging is our peripheral vision, our field of peripheral vision decreases, right? So normally when I'm doing this, I'm standing up in front of a group. But if you sit and stare right ahead, straight ahead of you, and notice how far in the outer ranges of your peripheral vision, like how far can you see to the side while you're staring straight ahead? Right? So as we age, our field of vision actually shrinks a little bit. So it might be to here for normal aging by the time you're saying your 70s. For people with dementia, it could be like here. So if this is your field of vision and I'm sitting next to you, trying to talk to you and get your attention and show you something on a piece of paper or whatever it might be, you're not going to see me too well. And that's going to make it really, really hard to communicate, to understand, certainly to follow through with anything that you're saying after that conversation. So when you're communicating with an older adult in general, you're going to say their field of vision is going to be a little bit smaller. Can I get myself right in front of that person? And for sure, if you know that they have a vision impairment or a hearing impairment, you want to get in front of them. A few of you said read lips, right? Really hard to read lips to the side. Much easier when you're right in front of the person. So you want to keep that in mind if you can. Um, Not only face them, but get their attention first, right? So if I have a vision impairment and I'm looking down at something and you're talking to me, I'm sorry, or hearing impairment, I'm not hearing you, I'm not going to pick up what you're saying. So you want to make sure you're facing them. You want to make sure you have their attention, right? These are some things that you can do. Cut out the distractions you absolutely mentioned, turn that TV off, turn the radio off, or move to a quieter area. Also, you can smile, right? So you can indicate, this is okay. We're going to figure this out. I'm in this with you, right? So you can communicate quite a bit with your nonverbal communication. And you can also use hand gestures. So any of you that communicate with people who don't speak the same language that you are speaking at that moment, really understand the value of some of these universal hand gestures. And so you can start to bring those into your conversation a little bit more. If you notice someone has a hearing impairment, another strategy that you can use is to lower the octave of your voice if you can. For older people, it tends to be easier for them to hear voices in lower octaves as opposed to higher octaves. And so it's kind of counterintuitive to raise your voice too much, because when you raise your voice, you often start to talk in a higher register, just where it's harder for a lot of older adults to hear. And there's sort of a franticness that you're often communicating that is a nonverbal communication that you might not want to be introducing into the conversation. So smiling and taking a breath and trying to slow down just a little bit and say, here's what I want you to understand about this communication, and try to lower the octave of your voice. Those things will help when you are talking to older adults. The tricky part is not to go so far into condensation. Like you don't want to be condescending to them and be like talking down to them. So you just have to be thinking about that, and always watching them for signs of what they're picking up, but you really don't want to disrespect anyone. So nearly 25% of folks 65 to 74 do indicate that they have hearing problems, and 50% of those 75 or older say that they have hearing problems. And actually, unfortunately, not many of those people are compensating for it. So one study found that among adults 70 and older with hearing loss who could benefit from hearing aids, fewer than 1 in 3 have ever used them, right? So that's problematic. I know there are a lot of barriers to hearing aids. They are costly, very, very costly. Actually, I got mine, fortunately, with help from the state, because I do need them for my work, which older adults may or might not be able to do, but it can be a problem. And then some people just don't want them because they do distort everything. They can't replicate the human ear yet. So they make everything louder. They absolutely help, but they're not perfect. And they're very high tech now. So you can, if you can pay more, you can get more options in terms of which sound channels to bring up and which sound channels to bring down. Like you can bring down the clinking silverware channel and try to bring up human voices if that's your priority, and so on. So it's interesting what they've done. Common changes for you to be aware of. This is normal hearing, right? Normal age-related hearing changes. Loss of clarity, so things can sound garbled. High-pitched sounds become buzzy. Certain sounds become indistinguishable. S's and F's and Z's are really hard to tell the difference between and among. And this is huge, background and foreground issues. So this comes back to the whole TV and radio thing. If you have TV and radio on in the background, but you're trying to have a conversation in the foreground, it'd be really, really hard. If you're in a loud restaurant, you remember restaurants again? You may have experienced this where you're in a loud setting or a party or whatever, and there's a lot of background noise and you're trying to have a conversation, and it can be really, really hard. this could be one of the reasons that older adults shy away from large family gatherings. It's even worse for people that have dementia, but just general hearing issues. So cutting down on any of the background noise that you can is going to help that person to hear you better. I love this quote from Helen Keller: blindness cuts people off from the environment, deafness cuts them off from other people. I actually, as a person with pretty significant hearing loss, I would say both, because there's absolutely things with me not being able to hear that I just say no to. I'm like, it's going to be embarrassing. I'm just not going, you know? So it does cut me off from the environment to some degree, or even if I'm in an environment, I'm missing a lot that goes on because I can't hear it. And I'm pretty quick at, like, if I'm talking to someone and they start laughing, I'm pretty quick to go, no idea what they just said, you know? So people can have some social cues and graces to kind of get through a situation. It doesn't mean that they're hearing what's going on or seeing. And also deafness cuts you off from other people. I can remember one of the earliest experiences I had. I think I was in my 20s, and I was at a huge conference in New York with, like, it was literally 700 people in one of those massive ballrooms. And it was an aging sensitivity activity. And so we had cotton in our ears, right? And gloves on and glasses that were fogged up and all of that. And we were supposed to talk to one person. And everyone was doing this activity at the same time. And so it got loud in there because a lot of people talking. And I honestly couldn't hear. So the first time I couldn't hear my partner, I said, sorry. And she said it again. And I could tell she said the exact same thing because of, like, picking up the cadence of her voice, but I still couldn't hear. And I said, excuse me, sorry, can you repeat that? And at the third time, when she said the exact same thing, I was like getting embarrassed that I still couldn't hear her. And so I did what you do in a foreign country. I was like, wow, okay. And I then took over some part of the conversation to, like, go on with it so we could get past that moment. It was really embarrassing. And I thought, oh my God, like, I really couldn't hear this person. So I want you to be aware of that. If you pick up on those clues, the person's not answering properly, they're repeating the same thing, you get some clue that they're not hearing. You could also try to use different words, right? I knew she was saying the exact same thing. Maybe if she used different words, if she slowed down, she dropped the octave of her voice, if she could enunciate more, if she could just check in with me. I'm not sure you're hearing me. Is this ear better? You know, she could have written it down, right? Use a different kind of a cue. So you can let it go by if a person is getting embarrassed and if that bit of the communication is not that critical. But if you really need to communicate something, it's a family member, it's a client, you need to kind of stop and figure out what's going to be helpful for that individual that you're trying to communicate with. Okay. You can ask them about hearing aids too. So some ramifications of sensory loss. We've spent quite a bit of time on this because these are things that are complex when you communicate with an older person. And it's things that you can actually do quite a bit about if you have understanding about what strategies to try, and if you have understanding about how do I know that this person has a problem. So we've already touched on some of the ramifications of sensory loss: confusion, embarrassment, loss of confidence, isolation, difficulty completing everyday tasks, and trouble functioning. How does a person who has vision impairment read that medicine bottle? How do they know they're taking the right medicine, right? If you can't hear what the doctor says or what the coach says, how are you ever going to be able to follow through on what that person says? Sensory impairment has huge ramifications. There's increased risk of compromised nutrition, of accidents, of not following through with guidance. And people can actually be misdiagnosed with depression or dementia when it might be a sensory loss that is either responsible for it or at least contributing to it and making it worse. So in short, sensory loss is huge for older people, and yet most sensory loss can be improved. Also, just cleaning someone's glasses actually can be a huge thing. If you see how dirty sometimes people can have their glasses. That can be a big thing. So knowing that it can be improved, or you can compensate with the things that we are indicated today. So any questions about that before we go on to COVID? Okay, excellent. So as we're going on to COVID, I just want to pull out a study result to share with you. And this is a little quiz question, so you're going to be able to put your answer in the chat. Which do you think is the most important in communication? Verbal, vocal, visual? When someone's trying to understand your communication, do they rely on verbally what you're saying, vocally, what they hear from you, kind of visually, what they see? We got some votes for vocal, visual, all of them. Good one, Anna. All. Visual. Okay. Here are the results. People understand your communication. 7% of it is what the verbal messaging is. 38% vocally, how you say it or what they're hearing. And 55% visual. That's kind of incredible, right? So turns out that 93% of communication is nonverbal. It's not just the words that we're saying to someone that they pick up and they understand from our communication. All of these other things go into it. So now let's talk about COVID and communicating through PPE. So is it any harder to understand what I'm saying when I have a mask on? And how much are you getting from my mouth and my right? So when 2/3 of your face is cut off from a person who may have normal age-related sensory impairment, and maybe they have a very common vision illness, right? Like glaucoma or cataracts. And then you introduce the PPE with a mask. And not only that, but stay 6 feet away. So if they have a hearing issue, right? Really, really, really hard and really challenging to communicate with anyone through PPE, but it's especially hard to communicate with older adults through PPE. Okay, so let's just add communicating with PPE with dementia. So that is a whole nother kind of topic that we're not going to spend we could do whole workshops on dementia and communicating through dementia. But for today, I just wanted to give a couple of tips on that. So one thing you can do, one strategy you can do is not build a wall of words. I am building a wall of words as I talk to you today because I'm going blah, 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 blah. And this is the way that we often communicate. But when I talk to people with dementia, I try to simplify my words. If I pick up that they're not following me, right? They're not on track. So instead of saying, hi, first of all, slow it down. So, hi, Amy. Hi, Amy. I'm Donna. I'm here to talk to you about this program, and then maybe we can have some lunch. And how's your day going? And isn't this horrible with these masks and all of this stuff? And in our small talk and in trying to connect with someone, we often build a wall of words. It's just really hard for any older adult with sensory impairment to weed through, but it's really, really hard for people with dementia. So consider that kind of blah, 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 chatter style with, hi, Amy, lunch, let's go. Okay. Hi, Amy. Have you read this? Here. Okay. So you're simplifying your messaging and really having them just focus in on the things that you need to have them focus in on. There was also some other stuff that was going on with that. A gesture, right? Thinking about those universal gestures that you can use to help a person understand. Slowing it down to some degree. Checking with them. Have you seen this? Right? Focusing their attention on what you want them to see. So I think when you're communicating in general, this might be helpful, but for sure, if you're talking to someone that has dementia, you want to think, I want to focus in on the most important message that I really need them to understand. I want to reinforce it. I want to check with them. Have you seen this? Are you doing this? How can I help you kind of get that specific thing incorporated into your life? Those are a couple different strategies that you can use. You might try the shield style PPE so that they can still see a little bit more. I don't know if any of you have used the masks that have the clear um, in the mouth. It looks a little freaky to me, honestly. Like a clown type of deal. But I'm curious if anyone has any experience with that, if that's really helpful to communicate any better through PPE. And we actually covered a lot of the other things. I guess the only other piece I would say there is to set your expectations. A couple of you in the chat mentioned having patience, and I think that's super important. So unfortunately, we all have lots and lots to do, and so it means that we hurry through our day sometimes. It's not going to help you communicate any better to kind of say it fast and get out of there without having the person understood much of what you said. So going in with the expectation that it will take longer to communicate with an older person, it will take longer even to communicate with an older person through PPE, and even longer communicating with an older person through PPE if they have dementia. Okay, so they don't have a choice. They can't get their hearing to be improved just because you're in a hurry that day, or they can't get their vision to improve just because you're in a hurry that day. You can change your strategies after learning a little bit more about it. You can slow down to help them to understand better. You're the only one that can make an impact in how that whole exchange happens. So let's talk about COVID and social isolation and older adults. This is huge. This is huge, 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 huge. And I'm sure you're seeing it in your clients. I'm sure you're seeing it in your families. There is a handout that you were provided with your workshop materials that addresses this specifically. It's really a wonderful program that's going on in Connecticut that addresses social isolation in older adults. So I'm not going to spend too much time going through it because you really have more information and step-by-step instructions on how to access services for someone who fits the category of social isolation and an older adult or a person with disabilities actually as well. I just want you to know that you have that. Technology access and comfort. This sort of goes hand in hand with social isolation. It's often older adults that have less access to tech and way less comfort with tech. And I have to tell you, in the last year that I've been working through the pandemic, it's really become apparent to me that technology is kind of like a social determinant of health, even more than we realized. And it's sort of critical. And every topic, no matter what I'm giving a workshop on these days, I find a way to slip in there technology access and comfort and just raising people's awareness about it. Because if you can help one older adult either access more technology or get more comfortable with how to use a feature of technology, you are going to change their life. It's a gift to them in ways that are enormous, right? And if you got into this meeting, you know, even if you're like, oh, tech, I'm not that good at it. If you got into this meeting, you can help an older person get onto Zoom, right? If you receive messages by email, even if you're not the fastest or the best at it, you can help someone understand email. If you know how to send someone a picture or click on a link and surf something on the internet, you can help someone to do that better. So I really want to invite you and empower you to do this and think about in your family, in your clients, how can you help anybody to have more access to technology and more comfort with it? Actually, I got the opportunity just this week to speak to a colleague of mine, and any of you up in like the Hartford area, generally speaking, next month, it turns out we just got figured out this week, I'm going to be giving the keynote at the annual meeting of the North Central Area Agency on Aging on March 31st, and this is going to be the topic. And so I was sort of batting around ideas with my colleague Maureen McIntyre there, and I was saying, oh, this tech issue, I think this is so big. And she liked it. So I'm going to be developing this concept even a bit further. And so if you want to tune into that, it's March 31st, North Central Area Agency on Aging. That might be a chance to think a little bit more about it. So that is important. And I think if I could think of one strategy that would really impact older adults in the context of COVID, it's technology. So I would like you to focus on that. There are some resources for people that financially don't have access to tech. And contact me after if you want to talk any more about that, or if you have resources like that to share, that would be wonderful. Um, and just do something with this. Teach one person this week something about technology. You will change their life. You'll also have them be less socially isolated. Not only can people contact other people if they can get on Zoom, email, and so on, but they can also these days enrich their life from home. Any number of museums and music programs and faith communities are opening up their services. In all the ways that that word can be understood, and really making things available. You can travel, you can revisit places you went. There's all kinds, you can take classes, free classes. There's all kinds of worlds that get opened up for people once they understand technology. I will just say this about tech. Talk about patience. You need patience if you're teaching someone technology when they're not used to it. There are people who didn't grow up with tech, which is probably a lot of us on this call, and for sure people older than us. We don't have the brain structures already established in our brains to quickly understand technology. I look at my little cousins literally as toddlers taking their parents' phones and do, and they can make things happen on a phone. So it's sort of funny and interesting to watch that, but what's happening in their brain is they're having brain cells, neurons, line up in pathways, and they're forming neural pathways as they're getting to use technology from this very, very young age. And so if I said to my kids, even who are college age and just after college, like, guys, here's this new thing I want you to do. It's called texting. And it's going to take about 3 hours. So, set aside 3 hours and play around with it, ask questions, read about it, try it out a few times, and then you're going to get to know how to text. That's a good thing. And my kids would be like, are you crazy? They just like try a few different buttons and they have the brain structure there already to kind of more quickly understand how to use their new technology or a new feature they might not have used. If I say to an older person, texting, let me teach you how to do that. It literally could take 3 hours for them to have to sit down and understand, wait, which button? Because they don't have infrastructure in their brain to understand that. So you understanding that will maybe give you, you're going to get frustrated, but it's have a little more patience in trying to help somebody with something and understand they just don't have the structures. It doesn't mean that they cannot learn at any age, because they can, unless they have a disease like dementia that might make it hard for them to retain short-term memory and organize their thinking and plan and all of that brain function that you need. But short of that, people can learn. So this week, I invite you to teach someone something technology related. I could talk a lot longer about this, as you see, but I'll jump off the high horse or whatever at this point on that topic. To move on to special populations and special considerations. So this workshop was organized with the idea that everybody communicating with an older adult really needs to understand vision and hearing pretty deeply, because those are the things that come into play. However, age and sensory impairment is probably not the top priority for people. So as you think of the older people that you are communicating with, there might be something else. Maybe they are a grandparent raising grandchildren. This is another topic near and dear to my heart. I worked at the Consultation Center at Yale for 9 years, running a program for grandparents raising grandchildren. Still do a lot of work nationally in coalitions about that, and connect with my people in New Haven and Hamden whenever I can. But for people who are grandparents raising grandchildren, that is going to be their top priority issue and concern, right? If they're a grandparents raising a grandchild or babysitting and being involved in your grandchild's life in a significant way, that might be primary, right? What are their needs related to that? Talk about access to technology. How do you supervise your children, who are all virtual learners now, remote learning from your home, if you don't understand the first thing about it? Okay. How do you access services, healthcare services, social services, and so on? So finding out for that person, what is, I'm saying special population, but really it's more like, what's their priority? So older person, yes, they're that, but what's more important? Are they a grandparent raising a grandchild? Are they a person living with dementia, right? And so if they are, what's their priority there? What resources do they need there? Virtual doctor's appointments, absolutely. It's really hard to even access healthcare these days if you can't access technology or don't have comfort with technology. So being a grandparent raising a grandchild, being a person living with dementia, being a family caregiver, maybe that's their priority. And oftentimes people think of family caregivers as adult children of aging parents. That's absolutely one type of family caregiver. There are also spousal caregivers or partners, right? You're kind of caring for the person you're in a significant relationship with, your friends, your neighbors, you're in the same faith community, people that you care about, even if you're not their primary caregiver. And maybe that's important with social distancing and keeping people safe. People are less able to visit in person, less able to spend time with their people. How can you be a caregiver if you can't contact the person? So understanding resources that are available for family caregivers, I think, is also really important. We could go on with some of these special situations, but I just wanted to bring a few of those up. And when we get to the resources section, I'm going to point you guys to resources to learn even more about these situations. Before moving on to a next category, I just also want to mention intersectionality, right, which exists. So you could be a person who's a grandparent raising grandchildren and have low income and be a minority, right? So there's intersectionality there. There's research that says people who are lower income, people who are minority, very unfortunately, tend to have less technology in their lives, tend to have less access with technology. If you don't have access, you're certainly not going to have comfort. And now you're a grandparent raising grandchildren on top of that. So intersectionality can really exacerbate any of your issue that you're dealing with, your priority issue, even more than just you're an older person. So when you deal with people, I want you to certainly recognize how multidisciplinary their lives are and what is their priority. And finding resources is going to be your top priority there, depending on what you understand their situation to be. Vulnerability preparedness planning is sort of another thing that we can talk a whole lot about. I've done workshops on all of these things, so it's a little frustrating to just do the highlights reel for you, but just pointing that out, I feel like is helpful in some way to have it on your radar. So one thing that we're not necessarily wonderful at is vulnerability preparedness planning for older adults with dementia, for older adults who are disabled. And so I don't, if you are, if any of you are in a situation where you can take it on in a systemic way, that's amazing in your agency or your organization. If that's not your scenario and you could take it on as an individual, that can also help. So say you're working with a client that has a wheelchair or a walker, right? We know that with climate change and some of the things that are going on, we're having more power outs lately, right? So can your person with a walker or a wheelchair go to a shelter? Do they have an idea of what shelter might be close to them that's wheelchair or walker accessible? Okay, so does their town social worker or their municipal agent know that there's a vulnerable person living in this community? How can we connect them to services generally, or how can we connect them to services in the event of a crisis in their area? So vulnerability preparedness planning, I'm just trying to bring it down to the individual level to have you even think about it in terms of your folks, and then how can people get them, get the help that they need. Find resources, yep, to connect them out. Yeah, super duper hard. So how do you deal with this in addition to an older person who cannot read? So I would say, great question, Sylvia. I would say use the time in between crises to figure out what's going to work. So when you're not in a crisis, you can say, let's think about if you were ever out of power, or when you've been out of power, what do you do? Who's on your emergency planning list, right? Who's your emergency contact list? How would you get from place A to place B? Who would help you with that? Who are agencies, that can help? Like there's all kinds of ways to think it through in between and find out who their people are, what resources are available to them, and then how they would put that plan into action. So I don't know if you did this if any of you had kids, but I remember when I was growing up and with my own kids when they were little, the schools would sometimes encourage us to have like an emergency plan in case there was a fire. Why they picked fire as the one thing, I don't know, but it was always about having a fire, poo, poo, poo in your house. And what would you do? And it was like, for ours, it was go to our neighbor's house, like we sort of had a little plan about it. And I feel like vulnerability preparedness planning is sort of thinking through, if this, then what? What would I do? So I would say there's no sort of magic answer, but just to be thinking about it and trying to marshal resources and have a plan and have other people involved, because your first responders in a time of a crisis are going to be taken up with other things, most likely. And especially if they're just learning that that older person is in their community on the spot. Any other thoughts about that people want to share, actually, or strategies that you've found that work? Okay. I feel like some of what we're doing today is just raising your awareness about certain things so that you can be thinking about them going forward. And going on from there, I guess I just wanted to make some general points to have you remember that you have the power to humanize each and every contact that you have with anyone, but for sure an older person. So we talk about people being socially isolated and living alone, perhaps. 45% of women 75 years and older live alone. So almost half of women 75 and older live alone. Think about how many fewer contacts they have now in the context of this pandemic. And so even if you're contacting them as a service provider and not as sort of a social call or a family member or a friend, you can humanize that contact. That's no small thing. To understand the opportunity that you have in bringing empathy and respect, human to human, to each and every contact. I would really encourage you to set your intention with that before you pick up that phone or before you go to meet the person. Don't ever reduce an individual to their impairment. I am not asking you to chime in the chat on this, but I am guessing that each and every person on this call has some challenge that they're facing physically, cognitively, financially, things that make you vulnerable. We all have that. And I also don't think that that's all of you. I think that's part of you, right? So older adults may have a longer list than we have at the moment, or maybe not, but never reduce a person to their impairment, okay? So they're a person with dementia. You see this in healthcare settings sometimes. Oh, she's the biter, she's the yeller, she's whatever. So never ever do that. I just want you to guard against that. Really to just take a minute and think about any assumptions that you might have about aging and older adults and kind of combat ageism. We all have it. Ageism is kind of the one bias that culturally people still are sort of allowed to engage in publicly, with less ramification than they might if they were engaging in racist or sexist kind of thinking and behavior. And you just have to go to the greeting card aisle in the store to see some evidence of that. We can all laugh about aging and old people, and if it's not their bodies, it's their mind. Isn't that tremendously funny, right? So we want to just think about what we expect of an old person, that they're just going to kind of be there and be quiet and not make a fuss. They're going to be so grateful. They're always going to be the needy one in the conversation. We're going to be the stronger one helping them. It's not necessarily true. People who have sensory impairment, people that have illness, people that have dementia, give a lot to the people in their lives and can give as well as receive. So you want to just be really careful about any unconscious is hard to be aware of, but make conscious and tune into any biases that you are aware of and try to combat some of that ageist thinking. And just to remember, everyone wants to be treated with dignity and respect. Moving on to our last section, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because you do have the slides on these, but we talked about special populations or what's the person's priority issue, and this kind of speaks to some of that. So I'm sure you've all checked out your resources for older adults that is available right now on the coach page. I took a look at it. There's a lot of great stuff on there, really important things for you to know about. I would just add a few more to those. And this is the Alzheimer's Association. Um, and this is kind of just a screenshot of some stuff that was on their website and the link so that you can get to them. One thing I really want to highlight about the Alzheimer's Association is that they help people with any kind of dementia, not only Alzheimer's disease, you should know that. And they have an 800 number that is their hotline. And you can see that right here on your screenshot. If you go to their website, it's there as well. This is great. It's 24/7. If you as a professional want to call, hey, I'm looking for resources for a person in this part of the state. Actually, they exist internationally, so you could find resources for someone in another state as well. Or, hey, I'm a caregiver for my dad and he's doing this. I don't really know what to make of it. Can you help me with it? Call the helpline. Hey, I'm looking for a support group for a caregiver. We have more than 100 support groups here in Connecticut for people who are dementia caregivers. They're an amazing, amazing resource. Their website is actually quite helpful as well. This is Tech Act, and you can look a little bit more at their website to see what they have. This is one of the, there are a couple different entry points to that program about social isolation for older adults and people with disabilities in our state that I gave you the handout on. This is one of the organizations that's an access point for that, and they have other resources as well. This one is Engaged, National Resource Center for Engaging Older Adults. This one's kind of interesting. If any of you are in a position to be program planners or just like project planners within your organization, there's really good ideas on here about stuff that's going on all over the country. And so it can give you a sense of some model programs and best practices to be looking at and to give you ideas. They do have a section on COVID-19 specifically, so you can just kind of glance through that and see what you can pick up for your work or for your life. Grandparents raising grandchildren. If I was picking one resource at this time, I picked 211 because it seemed to be kind of a nice overview of some of the legal, right here, the screenshot is custody and guardianship issues and kind of the legal end of that. But if you scroll down a little bit more, they give other resources of support groups and different services available for grandparents raising grandchildren. So 211, I guess, is a decent enough starting place for that. Protective services for the elderly. That should be on your list for sure. This is an important resource that hopefully you're already familiar with. I have some warning signs of elder abuse up here just for you to understand or remember, be reminded of what those are. And this is a tremendous resource that you should just know about. It's not, it can sometimes be the best thing. I know people can be reluctant to call them, but it can sometimes be the very best thing you can do to bring attention to a situation, to get help for the person who might be on the receiving end of that elder abuse, and also for the person who might be the perpetrator of that. Sometimes it's about bringing more resources in and they can help with that. Sometimes it's about educating people. Sometimes it's about respite and having some of that pressure released. Talk about COVID. Unfortunately, cases of elder abuse are up in the pandemic as people are feeling a lot more stressed about their own finances, their work, having kids at home all the time, having caregiving responsibilities. So this is something you absolutely need to be aware of. And I would say don't hesitate to make use of it. They're wonderful, caring people who work at protective services for the elderly. And my last slide, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, is just my contact information. So Borrow My Glasses is my gerontology education organization. We're all about aging and caregiving from a new perspective. I think I mentioned that we could have talked for a lot longer about all of the things on covered today on these various lists. And that's what we do. We do a lot of workshops to help professionals who work with older adults, and we help family caregivers and we help organizations as well. So I am here for you as a resource. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you want to hop onto our website, we are in the middle of a website revamp, I will say that, so check back. But if you want to put yourself on our mail list, you'll learn when we're making big changes like that, and you'll learn about the different workshops that we offer. Many of those are at no charge, and some of those offer continuing education credits for professionals. So if you hop on the mail list, you'll get to know more about what we're doing. But I'm here as a resource as well.